Hello and welcome to today's webinar on Tracking Autism's Heterogeneity over Time, featuring Stelios Georgiades. I am Claire Cameron, Engagement Editor at Spectrum, the home for autism research news and analysis. We'll begin the presentation in a moment, but first, know that we'll be fielding questions at the end of today's presentation, but you can ask them at any time during the session. To ask a question, please submit them via the chat window at the base of your screen or via the Q&A feature. And as always, I'll note if there are any members of the press tuning in, you can only report information presented during this webinar if that material has already been published elsewhere or if you have first obtained express written permission from the presenter. Stelios Georgiades joins us from Hamilton, Ontario, where he is Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioural Neurosciences at McMaster University. Prior to joining the faculty at McMaster, Georgiades completed his BA and MA at the University of Oregon and went on to do a PhD in Health Research Methodology at McMaster. Alongside his professorship, Georgiades is a co-director of the McMaster Autism Research Team and the co-founder of the Child Health Specialization in the Bachelor of Health Science program and a core member of the Offord Centre for Child Studies. His research focuses on developmental trajectories and the clinical and biological heterogeneity of autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. He is co-principal investigator for the PON Network, an Ontario-wide research program that aims to improve long-term outcomes for children with neurodevelopmental conditions, including autism. He is also a co-investigator on a longitudinal study of autistic children and young adults across Canada. Welcome, Professor Georgiades.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Claire, and thank you to Spectrum for the invitation. It is great to have this opportunity to connect with audience and colleagues from all over the world. So today I'm going to briefly describe a program of research that involves the work of not just multiple individuals, but multiple teams that I'm part of. And I'm going to focus on exploring heterogeneity in autism over time. If you're following us on Twitter, these are some of the handles and hashtags that you can use. So I'm going to divide the webinar in 4 sections. I'm going to start by describing the longitudinal pathways in ASD study here in Canada. I'm going to share some of the empirical findings from this study demonstrating that autism is a heterogeneous disorder. I'm going to introduce a new concept we call chronogeneity for the study of autism heterogeneity in relation to time. And I'm going to end by introducing a pilot study that we're running here at McMaster called the Pediatric Autism Research Cohort, or the PARC study. So the pathways in ASD study, what you see here is a picture. It's a bit old. Everyone looks a bit younger in this picture than we are right now. It's a multi-site interdisciplinary collaboration across 5 provinces here in Canada. It is funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. It started back in 2004 and it's ongoing. The principal investigator is Dr. Peter Zamari, who I know is a colleague and mentor of many of us here. And as I said, it's run across 5 Canadian sites. And the main idea is to follow newly diagnosed children with autism into their adolescence years and describe the developmental trajectories of these children with ASD. The study has so far produced over 30 publications. It has also served as a very powerful training platform for over 80 students and trainees. It is an ecological longitudinal study, meaning that the child is studied within the context of the family, services, school, and community. And the same cohort of children are followed from the point of diagnosis and into the teenage years. And I'm now going to share with you a very brief video, a whiteboard video. So the Pathways in ASD study is a longitudinal study with multiple assessment points from the time of diagnosis and into the adolescent years. And the idea is to describe the different trajectories that children follow over time and understand some of the factors and mechanisms that predict membership in these trajectories. As you can see in your screen, a few years ago, we published a paper using baseline data at the point of diagnosis, demonstrating the heterogeneity across children and across the two core diagnostic domains. So basically what this graph is showing is that if you plot the individual scores of children at the point of diagnosis across the two dimensions of social communication deficits and repetitive stereotype behaviors, you get a lot of variability in the way children score. And if you use some statistical techniques, you can start to derive empirical subgroups within the ASD population. As you can see, some kids score high or are severe on both symptom dimensions. That would be the green circle. Some children score high on the social communication deficits domain, but low on repetitive and stereotype behaviors, and the other way around. So basically, this paper demonstrated the variability across children and across domains at a given point in time around diagnosis. Now, we then collected longitudinal data on the same children, and we followed them over time. And in this paper, led by Peter Zabmari, we demonstrated heterogeneity not only across children and domains, but also across time. And specifically, we demonstrated that during the preschool years, so from diagnosis until age 6, there's distinct developmental trajectory groups of children across not just autistic symptom severity, but also adaptive functioning skills. These are the graphs from the specific paper. In this graph, you see that there's two distinct trajectories of autism symptom severity. The majority of children at the top are in a group that's labeled as more severe and stable. So we don't really see a lot of change in the symptom severity of approximately 90% of children. There's another subgroup of approximately 11% that shows a reduction in symptoms as children develop from the diagnosis point on to age 6. If you plot the adaptive functioning scores, you see that there's, again, variability in the levels of adaptive functioning, with 3 trajectories being the most optimal solution here. If you then try to plot the cross trajectory membership, something very interesting comes up. As you can see here, it is possible for a child to be in the stable and severe symptom trajectory, but at the same time do well in terms of their adaptive functioning. Similar story here, children who are in the more severe and stable symptom trajectory seem to be doing moderately well in terms of their adaptive functioning. So in other words, there's not a lot of yoking in terms of trajectory membership of symptom severity and adaptive functioning from the point of diagnosis to age 6. So the main message from these findings from the pathway study is that the idea of high versus low functioning that many of us have used over the years is just too simplistic. It doesn't really capture the heterogeneity we see within the spectrum across individuals, across domains, and over time. So we know that individuals with ASD have different strengths and challenges that vary across domains and over time. And logically, our models of care should reflect that dynamic variability. But the question is, do they? Everyone knows the saying, if you have seen one person with autism, you have seen one person with autism. And it clearly makes the case that autism is heterogeneous. So my colleagues and I went back to the same data that we presented in the JAMA Psychiatry paper, and we looked at the autism symptom severity trajectories. So in the original figure, we demonstrated two trajectories, one with the majority of kids in a stable, high severity trajectory, not showing any change in the symptoms over time, and a very small subgroup of kids who show some reduction in symptoms. So we tried to think about the same data, the same issue differently. So what we did in this figure was to plot the change in score from baseline to age 6. So from diagnosis to age 6. So if you haven't changed on your symptom severity, that means you should be scoring on the line that shows 0. If your severity has increased, you should be scoring above the 0 line. If your severity has decreased, you should be scoring below the 0 line. So in other words, this way of plotting the data and of thinking about the data shows that there's enormous variability, even in terms of the symptom severity over time. And if we go to the revised criteria in the DSM-5, we see that autism is a spectrum. It's defined by 2 dimensions. There are 5 clinical specifiers and 3 severity levels within each dimension. So the conceptualization of ASD in the DSM-5 speaks to the heterogeneity of the disorder. But our point is that we're not really using this heterogeneity in our research to better understand ASD. So we've made some progress in exploring ASD over time, but we try to use trajectories or single lines to connect A to B to C. And as we've seen, this approach may be too simplistic. It is a practical approach. We try to reduce variability so that we can understand it. But data reduction techniques are not always useful, especially when you're dealing with a disorder like autism that's so complex and heterogeneous. The other issue that concerns us is that trajectories are discrete, and mutually exclusive, which takes us back to the categorical approach prior to the DSM-5. So the question is, how can we overcome these limitations? We propose that we need to change our thinking. Instead of viewing heterogeneity as a post hoc obstacle, we should try and view it as informative variance. But to do that, we need better conceptual and methodological ways of capturing heterogeneity, especially in relation to time as children and youth grow and develop. We need to understand what predicts this heterogeneity, intervention effects, age, sex, genetics, biology, but we also need to make use of tools that are actually able to capture heterogeneity over time and look for possible turning points in individual and group trajectories. So we were able, using findings from our own work and findings from the work of others, to identify a gap in the literature. The question is, how do we move forward? So if there's one thing that my mentor, Peter Zatmari, taught me really well, is to collaborate with people who are smarter than you. So I'm sure that many of you recognize the people in this slide. These are the people that I've collaborated with over the past 2 years and have discussed this idea of better understanding heterogeneity in autism over time. So my 2 good friends and colleagues, Samuel Bishop and Thomas Fraser, and I got together and tried to write this down in a editorial perspective in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, and we introduced the concept of chronogeneity. As a concept, it simply means heterogeneity in relation to time, and chrono is the Greek word for time. As a methodological framework, it simply means a more systematic and closer investigation of the longitudinal trajectories of children, not only at the group level, which is what we tend to do, not only at the subgroup level, which some studies have attempted to do, but also at the individual level. As we know, clinicians and families are very interested in understanding individual development, individual trajectories. So by just giving them average trajectories or group trajectories through research studies, that might not be very useful in terms of the day-to-day clinical practice on the ground. The other point here is that in addition to understanding the levels of symptoms or levels of functioning in children that are marked by the intercept of a trajectory, it is also very important to understand the change, the growth over time identified by the slope of the trajectories. Now, the other interesting point that we make in this editorial perspective is that we're also in a position right now, based on conceptual advances and methodological advances to also start calculating the individual deviation of specific children from the group or subgroup trajectory. So for example, if you have a group of children receiving a similar intervention in your clinic, but you see that some children over time begin to deviate from that average group trajectory, that's important to document and try to understand. This is one of my favorite papers. The mean does not mean as much anymore, finding subgroups for tailored therapeutics. This is not specific to autism, but if you're interested, it is a paper that highlights the importance of understanding heterogeneity within the groups that you're studying. So the bigger issue here is in the era of big data, everyone talks about using big data to inform our understanding of disorder etiology, diagnosis, response to treatment, and prognosis. But the big question here is, how do you make sure that you go from big data, that you don't get lost in the big data, and are able to use research findings to inform the care of individuals on the ground in your clinic? And that's what we're trying to do here. So examining individuals in relation to subgroup trajectories is a key aspect of chronogeneity. In longitudinal studies, we're also beginning to use what's called mixed membership models. In statistics, when we try to derive distinct trajectories, we estimate the probability of different individuals in belonging to different trajectories. We kind of force individuals to go in either trajectory A, B, C, or D. And we kind of assume that those individuals remain within that trajectory over time. But we know that's not the case, either because of development itself or response to specific treatments. Individuals can actually move trajectories. So we want to make sure that we're able to capture that movement of individuals from one trajectory to the other as they grow and develop. When evaluating intervention, the patient's slopes are of interest rather than just calculating the endpoint values, and of course the patient deviation from the subgroup trajectory to identify those key moments and key characteristics in treatment efficacy. As I noted earlier, many of the measures that we use to track the development of children with autism over time are actually diagnostic measures, and they're not really designed to capture change over time. So we definitely need better measures to do that, measures that are sensitive to change. And I'm fortunate to work with a fantastic team from the US under the leadership of Summer Bishop from UCSF on the development of a standardized measure of social communication abilities for children with neurodevelopmental disorders. So this measure is under construction, so stay tuned for more on this. Here in Ontario, we are now at a crossroad where our local provincial government is investing a lot of money on redesigning the autism program, how children with autism receive services. I'm actually involved in the development of the new program with some great colleagues from across the province of Ontario. And we proposed a future continuum of autism services. The idea is that the clinic and the government of the province of Ontario will provide more flexible services at the level of intensity that actually meets the needs of each individual and each family. The question is, based on what evidence? We don't really have evidence at the systems level to understand what the changing needs of different kids are as they grow and develop. So to do this, we here at McMaster, we formed what's called the McMaster Autism Research Team, which is an interdisciplinary team of over 40 scientists and clinicians that are coming together to try and understand all issues related to autism and how we can contribute to enhancing the clinical care of individuals with autism. As part of MACART, we are running a pilot study, the Pediatric Autism Research Cohort, which is basically an empirical attempt to bridge the research to practice gap. On the one side, you will see our research center at the McMaster Innovation Park. On the other side, you will see the autism clinic at the Ron Joyce Children's Health Center. And what we're trying to do is bridge the research to practice gap through a specific study. The PARC study is a partnership between researchers, clinicians, and families. We have developed and we're now testing an ASD research protocol that is embedded within clinical practice. In the past, most of our research studies would take place parallel to clinical practice, but the dissemination of findings and the uptake of findings by our clinicians has not always been ideal. So we are moving the research protocol and the research efforts within the clinic, trying to bridge that gap. We have now recruited over 50 consecutive preschool children with ASD and their families at the point of entry into the new Ontario Autism program. So we want to capture the clinical pathways of these children as they enter the new OAP. We provide repeated assessments that combine the assessments that would actually happen in clinic anyways, and we've complemented those assessments with a set of socio-contextual measures that we're interested in. And we provide real-time feedback of research and clinical data, both to clinicians and to parents. And the idea here is to enhance communication between clinicians and families and make a more informed clinical decision-making process. The PARC study is implemented within the framework of a learning health system in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement and innovation. So as you can see here in this circle, researchers many times are only involved on collecting and analyzing data, interpreting some of those data, and publishing their findings in scientific journals. But there's always a gap in closing that loop, in moving that information into the clinic and then collecting information at the implementation intervention stage, feeding that back into the research cycle. So we're trying to close the loop within the learning health system framework. Every patient's characteristics and experience are available for study. Best practice knowledge is immediately available to support decisions on the ground, and improvement is continuous through ongoing study and research. And this happens routinely, economically, and almost invisibly to make sure that it's a sustainable framework. This is a schematic describing the PARC study. On the top row, you have what actually happens in the clinic. You have a diagnosis, you have service entry, a continuum of services, and outcome evaluation along the way. On the bottom row, you will see the research line, an ASD assessment at baseline, identification of both strengths and challenges of different children, and stratification of children based on that, service selection and adaptation based on the information collected, and longitudinal data that can inform the clinical pathways for these children and youth throughout their experience in the Ontario Autism program. So the potential impact of such an approach is to systematically examine chronogeneity, not just at the group or subgroup level, but also at the individual patient level. And that could inform our quest to understand the largely unknown factors and mechanisms predicting variability in ASD trajectories, but also outcomes. But what's important here is that we are trying to do this within the context of services and interventions. One of the major limitations of our previous longitudinal studies was that they were parallel to the service system. What we're trying to do now is understand trajectories and the factors that influence those trajectories within the service system and try to understand what is the impact of services and supports and specific interventions for specific children within our clinic. That will hopefully move us closer to more individualized and adaptive models of care for children, youth, and adults living on the spectrum. And as we're trying to document pathways, trajectories, and outcomes in children with autism, it is very important that we revisit the way we think about optimal outcomes. As many of you know, for years, the idea of optimal outcomes in autism had to do with a small subgroup of individuals who lose their diagnosis and who seem to score within normal range in terms of IQ and developmental functioning. My colleague Connie Casary and I felt that that was a rather limited approach to conceptualizing and studying optimal outcomes. So we've recently published a viewpoint in JAMA Pediatrics proposing a more comprehensive and inclusive definition of optimal outcomes, a definition that captures the diversity in individuals across the entire spectrum, not just those individuals who are functioning at higher levels. A definition that is based on within individual growth over time, as described in the chronogeneity concept, and a definition that describes progress on a wide range of variables and domains identified as meaningful by those living on the autism spectrum. So instead of researchers and clinicians deciding what the important domains and variables are to measure outcome, it is very important that those living on the spectrum and their families are actually part of the decision-making process here. So here's a list of references that are specifically related to the findings and ideas that I've discussed here today. And this is a list of my collaborators. This is my favorite slide. As you know, when you're trying to contribute to science, to clinical services, to policy, to training, and anything related to autism, the only way we can do it is through the power of collaboration. And I'm sure that you recognize many of the people that are listed here represent teams here in Canada, the US, but also in Europe. And I feel honored to be able to call these people my colleagues and collaborators. The most important thing is to thank the children and families that are participating in our research. They are the ones who show the way and that help us do better as researchers and as clinicians so that we're able to support them throughout their journey. This is a list of all the partners and funders that support the work that I described. And for those who need more information, I've listed 4 major websites. The first one is the website for the McMaster Autism Research Team. The second one is the website for the Pathway Study. The third one is the website for the Offutt Center for Child Studies here at McMaster University. And the fourth one is the website for the POND project that we're working on here in Ontario. If you want to watch a video on chronogeneity, you can go to the TEDx York U Saloon. And there's also a viewpoint in Spectrum that was published about a year ago, kind of providing a bit more information on this idea of tracking trajectories over time. And I will end my presentation there, and hopefully we'll now have time to move into a more interactional session and try to at least try and answer some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Stelios. We do have some questions. One of the first ones we have actually, which is one of your slides, so you might want to flick through, is what was the name of the article that you mentioned close to the beginning of your talk? I think it was the one just before. Yeah, that one.
This one.
Developmental, yeah.
Right, so the name is Investigating Phenotypic Heterogeneity in Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder, a Factor Mixture Modeling Approach. And that's published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry.
Great, thank you. Another question that we had was, in the interventions that you were tracking, is psychotherapy included in them? And if you could give some more detail about the different interventions that people are engaging in, that would be great.
So I think that's a very good question. You know, what are the interventions that we're tracking in order to understand their influence on the developmental trajectories of children? So in the specific study that we are running now at McMaster, this is for preschool children that are part of the Ontario Autism Program. So the Ontario Autism Program has specific interventions, mostly related to behavioral interventions, speech and language services, but not psychotherapy per se. So understanding the influence, I'm not gonna say the effects, but the influence of interventions on trajectories is a very complex issue. And as children and youth grow and develop, and as they begin to receive different types of interventions, you know, studying that becomes even more complex. But we have to start from somewhere, so we're starting with preschool children that are part of a very specific autism service program that includes mostly behavioral and language and some social skills interventions.
Just following up from that, are you planning on expanding into older school-age children and then also into teens and young adults and further?
Right. So here at McMaster, we're definitely interested in following these children as they grow and develop. The other hope here is that others will use this idea as a template. And I know of other groups around the globe who are already thinking of using this idea of chronogeneity in their longitudinal studies. There's a lot to be learned by studying preschool children, but there's going to be a lot of issues that don't really apply to those older children. You know, the pathway study is now in phase 3. We are following these children into the adolescent years. We're still collecting data during those years. But the issues, some of the issues change, not all, but some change. And studying those issues becomes an even more challenging but worthwhile task. So the answer is yes, we're planning on following these children over time, but in the meantime, there's a lot more groups out there who are using this systematic approach to understanding heterogeneity over time with older populations.
Another question we had was, would you describe your thoughts on comorbidities in autism and to what extent they might account for or help to explain some of the heterogeneity, and whether or not that's something that you're actively tracking as well?
Right. So I'm going to take a risk here and say that personally, I don't think we have a good understanding of comorbidity in individuals with autism. There's a lot of studies out there. There's a lot of analysis from other existing studies that were not designed to capture comorbidities, but I think we need studies that include the issue of comorbidities in their design upfront. Studying that in a longitudinal way would be very important, because as we know, different conditions and different challenges, you know, start at different developmental ages. As I said, in this case, with the PARC study, we are beginning with preschool children, and our intention is to carefully monitor and track comorbidities as these children grow and develop.
In the work that you've done so far, have you identified certain predictors that seem to predict an individual improving over time?
Right. So, so not just in our work, but in the work of other important research groups out there, there seem to be some predictors, you know, at baseline that predict your trajectory of functioning, your trajectory of symptom severity, and those are usually IQ, language level, in some cases, age of diagnosis, and sex. But I would say that many of the predictors that we use are not that modifiable. And we don't really have a good understanding of how these predictors actually function or work within the context of services. So what we're trying to do here is to take a step back and apply a more comprehensive and systematic investigation of these trajectories within the context of specific services. So instead of us saying predictor A, B, and C at diagnosis can help you decide the developmental trajectory of children, I think that's too simplistic. Children develop in different ways. Children develop in similar ways. They receive different interventions along the way in terms of type, intensity, duration. And unless we're able to track all of these and disentangle the effect and the influence of all of these contextual variables, then I would be very hesitant to say that A, B, or C can predict that you or your child will be in trajectory A, trajectory B, or trajectory C. So the way we see it here, this is more about tracking trajectories and using information as the child grows and develops to adapt and tailor the services and supports that are in place. This is not about guessing or predicting the future. It's more about using data and evidence to help you adapt services and supports on the ground.
Just to follow up from that, in the context of the PARC study, for children who are in the study already, if you're seeing certain trajectory, like seeing a child go on a certain trajectory and they're in a certain intervention that doesn't seem to be hitting an outcome that is desirable for that child, is the plan then that you would be in contact with the clinician who could then shift the child's intervention?
So to me, that is the key question. In the past, we would collect data as part of a research study and then publish our findings and then expect the clinicians to go find those scientific papers, make sense of those papers, and see if they can use them in any way in their day-to-day clinical practice. What's happening here is completely different. The clinical team and the research team are actually one team. As a researcher, my job is to collect, analyze, and report the research findings. And by doing so, the clinician who is already part of this same team will then make the appropriate decisions on adapting or refining the child's care on the ground. So it's not really my job as a researcher to determine that, but because we're working together with clinicians and because we're feeding our research findings back into the clinical team in real time, the hope is that we're able to influence in a positive way the services and supports and the clinical pathways of these children in our clinic here at McMaster.
Another question we have is whether you can speak to animal models of autism and measuring chronogeneity in them, and whether you know of any labs or researchers who are already doing this.
So here I'm not going to take a risk, and I'm going to say that I am not an expert in animal models. I know there's groups around the globe who are using animal models to identify subgroups, more homogeneous subgroups. But I would rather not comment simply because it's not really my expertise.
In the PARC study, how are you balancing standardization of assessments across follow-up visits and personal preferences with individual clinical providers? For example, do clinicians use a template for their follow-up visit notes in order to create standardization of clinical information that can then be used in research? And also, what assessments and questionnaires did you decide to require?
So this exact question came up at a stakeholder symposium that we had 2 years ago here on early intervention. And it's this idea, you're doing research and you need standardized tools and standardized assessments, At the same time, you have individual families and individual patients on the ground who might not fit that standardized template. So the idea here is to have a core standardized template that all children receive as part of their clinical practice, and then tailor the additional measures and the additional assessments based on the needs and the preferences of each family and each patient. A couple of years ago, Peter Zapmari and I wrote a viewpoint on finding the pragmatic balance between personalized care and evidence-based care. Evidence-based care is a concept that actually started here at McMaster and highlights the importance of not just using research evidence related to intervention and care, but also taking into account the clinician's expertise, but also the family's preferences and circumstances. So finding the balance across all these domains and dimensions is going to be crucial, and that's why we're running this pilot study now. We're also collecting a lot of qualitative information from families and clinicians, trying to understand what is it that works for them, what is it that's not a good fit with what they have in mind, and then we're going to develop the larger cohort study based on that feedback.
Another question we had is whether or not you are including family characteristics, for instance, education, family structure, social and economic background.
Yes, so both through the pathway study and through the PARC study, there's emphasis on understanding the family characteristics. Specifically in the PARC study, we have a sub-project that is led by a postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Stephen Gentles, who is here with us, supported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And Steve is specifically looking at family characteristics as they relate to what he calls family readiness to engage in services. You know, there's a lot of talk about engaging families in services, in decision-making, even in the administration and delivery of interventions in some cases. But it's very important to understand that not all families are ready at the same level. And not all families prefer to be that engaged, say, in service delivery. So understanding the family characteristics, understanding the family readiness to engage, and how those influence trajectories, and how the clinic can actually support these families to be more engaged in the process is a big part of what we're trying to do here with the PARC study.
Another question we had is regarding the representation of females with autism in your study. How are these participants ascertained? Were they specifically referred to your clinic, or was any child being offered special education services with suspected or confirmed autism diagnosis able to participate?
So ascertainment of our sample has always been an issue in autism. Even some of the best studies start with a clinical autism diagnosis as the inclusion criteria. Some of the studies, like the Baby SIPS consortium studies, don't. But I have to say that's one of the major limitations of the work that we do, that we tend to study and follow children who already have an ASD diagnosis. In the pathway study, we limited our sample to children from ages 2 to 5 at the point of diagnosis. And we know that there's other children who may receive a diagnosis, especially females, after the age of 5. So those were not included in the pathway study. In this pilot study here, the PARC study, again, we're only including children with a diagnosis, preschool children, but there's also a service within our clinic here that receives referrals for children at risk for autism. So that is something that we're considering, kind of expanding our recruitment outside the diagnostic boundaries, hoping that that will allow us to include some of the children, including females, that are otherwise excluded from the studies. Now, there's also the issue of older children, older females, and how those are usually excluded from our research studies. So that's something that we plan to look at as this cohort study enters the school years.
In terms of the reframing of optimal outcome, do you think that that could also be used to improve clinical trial success?
So the easy answer is yes, but that would take us back to the previous question related to standardization. When we are conducting clinical trials, we need to have at least a core standardized measure of outcomes so that we can decide, what works for whom and possibly why. So I think there's value in including measures that take participant views into account, but there's also value, in fact, it's actually necessary to make sure that there's a minimum level of standardization in the way we measure progress and outcomes in clinical trials.
Another question that we had previously to the webinar starting up was whether or not there's a plan to look at children who are grouped into certain subtypes more closely, and whether or not these cohorts might be made available to other researchers who are interested in studying particular subtypes or features of autism.
Mm-hmm. So my philosophy is that data should be made available, and using the right safeguards and checks. It should be made available to other researchers, and that's our plan here. There's a lot of confidentiality issues that we need to figure out. There's issues related to the quality of the science when someone wants to use someone else's data. But in principle, I think sharing data, trying to replicate our findings is the future. In fact, I think it's the present in many other fields, and that's something we should all seriously consider.
Will, at the end of the study and during the study, will you be able to provide information as to why some of the children don't respond to specific interventions?
Yes, so I think it's important to clarify here that the way this study is designed, it's not aiming to understand treatment effectiveness. To do that, there's other study designs, specifically clinical trials, but here we're trying to understand within the different developmental trajectories at the group, subgroup, and individual level, what does intervention, services, and support look like? What are these children receiving over time, and how is that influencing, their pathway? Is it pushing them towards a higher severity trajectory, towards a lower severity trajectory? Is it pushing them, in quotes, towards a more higher level of adaptive functioning? And which are those points along those trajectories that we observe that? So it's not a treatment effectiveness study. It's a study that attempts to identify the influence of the service system and the interventions included in that system on the different developmental trajectories of children.
How often are you assessing the children throughout this study?
Yeah, so during the preschool years, we felt that it's important to assess these children every 6 months, and that actually aligns with the clinical assessments at McMaster Children's Hospital.
Can you explain a little bit more about your service delivery model at McMaster Children's Hospital, and whether anecdotally you're seeing some families having difficulty accessing this model, and whether that constrains who is participating actively in the study?
So the issue of service access is a big one. It's a very important issue. It is no secret that In Canada and in the US, many children have to sit on a wait list before they access the service system. And what's been happening here at McMaster is actually pretty encouraging. You know, the clinical team and the administration team of the Children's Hospital is working on refining the entire clinical model, making sure that every child receives the services they need at the right time. We know that timing of services is very important. So there's an entire clinical model that has been developed using evidence, research evidence, but also using family input. And that's what the clinical team is now beginning to implement. And it allows children and families to follow different streams depending on their needs at different time points. And that dynamic variability in services at different points, that is exactly what we're interested in informing using our research data. But it's no secret that access to services is a big issue. Governments are working on it. But I think understanding the specific needs that specific children need at different points in time will be part of the solution and can help us kind of resolve this bottleneck that's happening when all children kind of enter the service system aiming to receive intensive services, when in fact some children might need less intensive services, some children might need a different type of services within the school system, for example. So that's exactly what we're trying to do here, use science and clinical practice to not only increase the evidence base, but also enhance access to services by these different families.
Okay, I think that we're all out of questions. Thank you for everyone for such a glut of questions. It's great to have so many. And thank you, Stelios, for taking the time to answer them in such detail. So that everybody knows, a complete replay of this webinar will be available on the Spectrum News site in a couple of days. You can also ask follow-up questions there for Stelios if you have any that were not brought up during this webinar. The webinar is part of an ongoing series, so please check our site for upcoming talks. We have a couple on there. The next is is in November, and we also have some upcoming in the spring, which will be announced soon. That you can also find video archives of previous webinars there. Thank you again, Professor Georgiades, and thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.